So today's our topic is cell membrane, which is also known as the plasma membrane. As we know that the cell membrane or plasma membrane is the outermost boundary in animal cells, while in the plant cell the cell membrane is also covered by an external boundary or an additional membrane, which we call as the cell wall. Cell wall is not our concern. Our concern is about the cell membrane, which is also known as the plasma membrane. We have to discuss about its functions, its relations, its characteristics, its structure, how it will arranged around the cell, and how it perform various types of the function, which functions are essential for the survival of the whole cell. So first of all, we discuss about the general characteristics of the cell membrane. What is the general characteristic? Now we studied that cell membrane is the outermost boundary of the cell, means that after the cell membrane there is no boundary exist around the cell. After the cell membrane there will be the extracellular matrix in which the interstitial fluid is included. Interstitial fluid, what is the interstitial fluid? This is the one cell and this is the two cell, and between the cells there is a fluid which exists. This fluid is known as the interstitial fluid. And we also know that suppose if this is a blood vessel carrying the blood, in the blood the constituents of the blood are the plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells. Plasma also include the 92% water, and rest of these are the minerals and plasma protein, which include the albumin, globulin, fibrinogen, etc. So the main constituent of the blood is plasma, which constitute about 55% of the blood, and in the 55% of the plasma, means if this is a plasma, then it constitute plasma is further made up of the 92% of the water, while the rest 8% will be the plasma protein, which we discussed that it may be albumin, fibrinogen, globulin, etc., and it may be minerals, etc. So the main constituent of the plasma is water. This is the water. Suppose this is the blood in which the water is present. So we called this interstitial fluid and this plasma in the blood both as the extracellular fluid. This is the plasma in the blood, and this is the interstitial fluid. What is the interstitial fluid? The fluid which exists between the two cells. If there is a third cell, then there is also a fluid exists between them. This is the interstitial fluid. So the interstitial fluid plus plasma of the blood, both are called the extracellular fluid, ECF. While intracellular fluid, what is intracellular fluid? Suppose this is the cell and this is the outer covering of the cell, and we know that the outer covering of cell is the plasma membrane, and the second name of the plasma membrane is cell membrane. Then inside the cell we know that the cytoplasm is present. In the cytoplasm cytosol exists, and the cytosol consists of 90% of the water. Suppose this is the cytosol. So in the cytosol there is also a fluid. So the fluid which is present inside the cell, we call this fluid as the intracellular fluid. Intra mean inside and cellular means cell, means the fluid which is present inside the cell is called the intracellular fluid, and the fluid which is present between the two cells means interstitial fluid, and the fluid which is present in the plasma, both are called the ECF or extracellular fluid. So what is the general characteristics of the cell membrane? First of all, we have to get rid of this. Now the general characteristics. We know that the cell membrane, as we discussed, that this is the cell, and center of the cell there is a nucleus, and around the nucleus there is a cytoplasm, and in the cytoplasm various organelles exist. This is the mitochondria, this is mitochondria, and the other is endoplasmic reticulum, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum, cytoskeleton, etc. Various organelles are present in the cytoplasm. So this outer boundary is cell membrane. Now this cell membrane is how much thick? So this cell membrane is very thin, not very much thick. The thickness of the cell membrane is about 7 to 10 nanometers. 7 to 10 nanometers thick. So it is not much thicker. We call this cell membrane as we call that cell membrane is not very much thick. It is thin. Because of the thinniness of the cell membrane, it can float, means it not represent as a rigid structure which no substance can pass through it. It is not a rigid structure, it is a flaccid structure, it is a thin structure through which the various substances enter into the cell from the, this is the ECF as we discussed, extracellular fluid, and this is the ICF, means intercellular fluid. Various substances on the regular basis enter into the cell. Various substances which include the minerals, hormones, proteins, etc., organic compounds, etc., on the regular basis enter into the cell, and from the inside of the cell, as we know that there are the various organelles, and we know that in the mitochondria aerobic respiration occur, and as a result of aerobic respiration we know that carbon dioxide is produced. So we have to get rid of this carbon dioxide and we have to enter the oxygen inside the blood, because aerobic respiration means respiration in the presence of oxygen. So this need oxygen and this expel carbon dioxide. So we have to expel this carbon dioxide from this whole cell to the ECF, and we also need this oxygen from the outside ECF. So there are various chemicals which are on the regular basis enter into the cell and outside the cell. So if the cell is rigid, not very thick, means this is thin because 7 to 10 nanometer 10 to the power minus 9. If it will be thicker, then no substance can easily penetrate into or outside the cell. But we know that many substances on the regular basis enter into or outside the cell. So that's why the cell membrane is not very much thicker structure. It is the thin structure. Then what is the composition of the cell membrane? Means which constituents made the cell membrane, or cell membrane is made up of which constituents? Then mainly cell membrane are composed of the two constituents. The first one is the proteins, which are made up of amino acids, and second one is lipids, which are made up of the fatty acids. Now how much protein percentage and how much lipid percentage contribute to make the structure of the whole cell membrane or the plasma membrane? So about 55% of the cell membrane is made up of proteins, while lipids, there are proteins and lipids are of several types. It may be phospholipid, it may be cholesterol, it may be sphingolipid, it may be phosphatidylcholine, it may be phosphatidylethanolamin, it may be phosphatidylserine. So there are many types of lipids, but we discussed that 55% protein, and lipids there are various types. Phospholipids, most abundant lipids present in the cell membrane are the phospholipids. Most abundant lipids present in the cell membrane are the phospholipids, which make up nearly 27% of the total cell membrane, and the other is second most abundant lipid in the cell membrane is cholesterol, which make up approximately 13% of the cell membrane, and other 4% also other lipids, which may be sphingolipid, phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethanolamin, phosphatidylserine, other, we call it other lipids. So which make up approximately 4%, and then 55%, 27%, 13%, 14%, and then there are also certain carbohydrates which constitute about the third component is the carbohydrate of cell membrane, which constitutes about 3% of the total cell membrane. So let's look at a quick revision. Proteins 55%, lipids 27%, 13%, 4%. How much it? This is 40% and 44%. So total lipids are 44%, 55% protein, 44% lipids, and 3% carbohydrate. So the first most abundant component of the cell membrane is protein, second most abundant is lipid, and which lipid is the most abundant? Phospholipid, then cholesterol, then there are other lipids, and the least abundant compound in the cell membrane is the carbohydrate, which considered only 3% of the carbohydrate. We have discussed about its general characteristic, its thickness, its composition. Then further we study about its structure. What is the structure of cell membrane? How it is arranged, means this is the cell, then around the cell how this cell membrane is arranged. We have to discuss this. So we discussed that mainly proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, mainly proteins and lipids. Carbohydrates are only 3%. So how the cell membrane is arranged? What is the fluid mosaic model? The cell membrane are arranged according to the fluid mosaic model. What is this model? According to this model, how the cell membrane are arranged? Phospholipid 27% of the total lipids. These mainly constitute the plasma membrane. First of all, we have to study the structure of the phospholipid. What is the structure of phospholipid? So phospholipids, as the name concerned, this is phospholipid. What we can get about from this name? Phosphor mean phosphate group, and lipid mean lipid. So in phospholipid, the lipids are present which contain the phosphate. What is its structure? So the general structure of phospholipid is CH2O, carbon double bond oxygen, alkyl group, then carbon hydrogen oxygen, carbon double bond O, and alkyl group, then carbon hydrogen. Where is the phosphate group? Now the phosphate group will come. This is the phosphate group that make this lipid from different from the other lipids, because it contain the phosphate group. This is the phosphate group which make this lipid different from the other groups. At the carbon number 3 phosphate group is present, that's why this is known as the phospholipid. Now there are various classes of the phospholipid, which may be phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethanolamine, phosphatidylserine. How it will forms? Just by replacing this hydroxide group, the nitrogenous bases, these are serine, choline, these are nitrogenous bases. If the nitrogenous base choline attached to this side, attached to this phosphate group, then the phospholipid which is formed is the, because choline attached, phosphatidylcholine. If serine attached, then it is the phosphatidylserine. If ethanolamine nitrogenous base is attached to the phosphate group of the third carbon of the phospholipid, then the phospholipid that is formed is phosphatidylethanolamine. So this hydroxide group is replaced, and the hydrogen of the, obviously for assume this is a nitrogenous base, the hydrogen of the nitrogenous base and hydroxide group contribute to form the water, and nitrogenous base will definitely attach to this phosphate group and form the various types of the phospholipid. So phospholipids has two regions. This is the head and this is the tail. This is the head of the phospholipid and this is the tail of phospholipid. Why we are discussing about this phospholipid? You may think that we have to study about the structure of the cell membrane. So to get into the complex things, we have to study about the basic structures. Basic structures will make up the cell membrane. So we have to study about the phospholipid. So I told you that phospholipid molecule consists of the head and the tail. Which portion of the phospholipid, head or tail, which portion contain the phosphate group and which portion contain the other rest of the lipid? So this head contain the phosphate group. This head contain the phosphate group, while this tail contain the fatty acid. The rest of the is the fatty acid. This is the phosphate group. This head contain the phosphate group and these tails contain the fatty acid. So this head, we know that phosphate group is polar. So due to this polarity of the phosphate group, the head become polar. The head become polar, and we know that fatty acids are non-polar. So this tail also become non-polar. because the constituents determine that the tail or the head will become polar, non-polar. The constituents of the head are polar, so the head become polar. The constituents of the tail are non-polar, so the tail become non-polar. We also call the polar and non-polar as hydrophilic and hydrophobic, because we know that the molecule of water, this is the molecule of water, oxygen has partial negative while hydrogens have partial positive charge. Water is a polar molecule. So according to the like dissolve like principle, polar molecule dissolves in the polar molecule. The head is the polar molecule. The head is the hydrophilic. We also call the head as hydrophilic. Hydro means water, philic means attractive, means which will attract towards the water, or water will attract the that portion of the head. So we call also this polar as the hydrophilic. Hydro means water and philic means attractive, means water attractive. While we know that the tail is composed of the fatty acids. Fatty acids are non-polar compound. So because of the non-polar do not dissolve in the water, because polar dissolves in polar and non-polar dissolves in non-polar. So the fatty acids dissolve in the non-polar. So the basic what is the basic structure of the cell membrane? Basically 27% are phospholipids. So we have to draw about the phospholipids. This is the ECF. I am drawing this, the heads of the phospholipid, and at the opposite side I also draw the heads of the phospholipid. Now what will remain? Tails. So these are the tails of phospholipid. These are the tails of phospholipid. These are the tails. You have to know why this structure is arranged in this way. Why it can't be arranged as the tails facing outside and these also tails facing inside. So first of all, you consider that this is the cell. So what is the inside of the cell and what is the outside of the cell? So where is the ICF, means intracellular fluid is present, means cytoplasm lie, and where is the ECF, means extracellular fluid lies. So this is the as we can see that this is the inside structure of the cell in which the ICF or intracellular fluid is present or cytoplasm is present. So we can call this as the inside of cell, inside cell, and this is outside structure of cell. And outside we know that ECF is present, mean extracellular fluid. This is the general structure. So why the heads of the phospholipid are facing the ECF, and in the same way the heads of the phospholipid are also facing the ICF? Why not the tails are facing the ECF and why not the tails are facing the ICF? What is the purpose of head lying towards the ECF or ICF? Why can't the tails lie towards the ECF or ICF? The general concept is that we already discussed that the heads are hydrophilic, means which may be soluble in the water, while this also head is the hydrophilic, while the tail is the hydrophobic. This tail is also hydrophobic, which will not dissolve in the water. So intracellular fluid, as we know that the intracellular fluid cytoplasms contain 90% of the water, means in ICF 90% of the water is present. So here is the ICF or intracellular fluid is the aqueous environment in which the water is present, whereas the ECF also contain as we discussed that this is the one cell, this is the other cell, then there is a fluid present, this is the interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid also contain the large amount of the water, so we also call this ECF is also the aqueous environment. So the heads are lying towards the aqueous external environment and the heads are also lying towards the aqueous internal या intracellular environment or intracellular fluid. So heads are hydrophilic, water is also polar. Hydrophilic means polar. These heads are polar, these heads are polar, water is also polar, which lies outside and which lies inside. Means both the outside of the cell and inside of the cell water is present, and because the water is present, so according to the like dissolved like, the polar region of the phospholipid will face this polar end of the water. So the polar region, we know that the polar region of the phospholipid is the head region, so that's why the polar region, head region, faces the polar region aqueous environment of outside, and the polar region of the head also faces the aqueous environment of the inside. That's why. And these tails are hydrophobic, so these repels the water, so these are repelling the water. That's why these are also extending away from the water. You can see that there is the water present, there is the water present, so they will extend away from the water, extend away from the water, extend away from the water. So that's why according to their structure, according to their hydrophilic or hydrophobic, and the cell membrane is lying in this way. Now you can see that the cell membrane constitute a lipid bilayer. Means this is the lipid bilayer. We can call this lipid bilayer. Why we are calling this lipid bilayer? Because this is the phospholipids molecule, and bilayer, this is the one layer, this is the two layers. So in one cell membrane there is a lipid bilayer exists, or we can also call this as the double layer of the lipids. Means this is the one layer of the lipid, this is the two layer of the lipid, double layer of the lipids, two lipid layers or one lipid bilayer. Two lipid layers or one lipid bilayer is present around the cell membrane. Oh sorry, I forgot about this tail. What is this tail means? This extended portion towards this side. This show as I told you that the tails are composed of the fatty acids. This show fatty acid are of two types: saturated fatty acid and unsaturated fatty acid. If there is a saturated fatty acid, this is the carbon carbon carbon, there is no double bond. If there is an unsaturated fatty acid, there will be a single or one or more than double bonds. So this is the unsaturated fatty acids, these are the saturated fatty acids. So this tail which lies straight, means this tail, one tail lies straight and other tails lie as curved, dangling outside. So the tail which lies straight contain all the saturated fatty acid, while the tail which is dangling outside is contain unsaturated fatty acid. Means there is unsaturation present in it. Means a double bond or many double bonds are present in these fatty acid. We know that the oleic acid is a monounsaturated fatty acid because it contain only one double bond at the position of carbon C9 to C8. One double bond is present. Oleic acid overall contains 18 carbons, while the palmitic acid, stearic acid are all saturated fatty acids. So I draw this both tails as straight. So this means that this tail also contains saturated fatty acid, this tail also contains saturated fatty acid, while this in this portion the one tail which is extending like a straight, this contain saturated fatty acid, while the one which is dangling outside contain the unsaturated fatty acid. We'll have to discuss about the function of the unsaturated fatty acid. If there is more concentration of the unsaturated fatty acid, what will be the purpose, what it will cause? We have to study about it. Will correlate with the fluidity of the cell membrane. We'll discuss it later.